for being here and for having me speak with you today. As Allison said, my name is Catie Brown. Today I'll start with an overview of our main dependent variable, valence bias, and I'll show the evidence that supports that the initial interpretation of ambiguity is negative. Then I'll review 2 behavioral studies that support the idea that reappraisal is necessary for positive interpretations of ambiguity. And then lastly, I'll spend a bit of time talking about the methods we use with EMG and EDA and other emotion regulation studies. How is volume, clarity, everything coming out so far?
I think it's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I'll
Just let me know if I need to make any changes.
You're good.
Perfect. Okay. So first of all, you will probably remember from Michel's talk about what valence bias is, but it has to do with how individuals interpret the valence of ambiguous stimuli, whether it's positive or negative. So take faces, for instance. When presented without any context, some faces are clearly negative. It's easy to think about a story about why she's making that expression. Maybe she saw something just really that made her angry in the environment. Same with clearly positive expressions like happiness. It's very easy to think of a story about why she's making a positive expression. However, the expression of surprise can be validly interpreted as either positive or negative. Perhaps she just won a dream vacation, or maybe she just witnessed like a horrible accident. She saw someone getting hurt. Either one of those could be the right answer if you see this without any clarifying context. So in our task, participants rate many faces as positive or negative, and we calculate the percentage of trials that they rate as negative. So here in this figure, each marker is one person's average across all trials. So for anger, you see that everybody on average pretty much says that anger is almost 100% negative. For happiness, you see that almost everybody says that happiness is less than 20% negative, so pretty positive. However, with surprise, you see a lot of variation. Some people are way up here saying that surprise is always negative. Some people are down here saying it's seldom negative when they look at many surprise faces. So for example, this one individual has a valence bias of about 65 because they rated 65% of surprise faces as negative. So one question that we have is, why is there so much individual variability? What are positive people doing differently to arrive at a positive interpretation? And why are the negative people stuck being negative? We do propose that positivity isn't just random, that it requires some effort because the default option is to resort to the negative. For example, reaction times, just on like a button press task, reaction times are faster when you rate surprise as negative versus as positive. And when we use mouse tracking, we see that people show a more direct trajectory when they rate surprise as negative. So in this task, they click start and then they move to this, in this case, would say negative. When the pink line here is when they're saying it's negative, it's like pretty much straight. But the green line here, in this case, their response would be positive. Instead of going straight to positivity, they're still drawn somewhat to the negative response first. So we think that individuals who arrive at a positive interpretation are using a regulatory process similar to cognitive reappraisal, so that they're overriding the initial negativity by reinterpreting the situation to be positive, that it's not just a quick, like random, like, oh yeah, that's definitely positive, that they're like seeing how it could be negative because it's ambiguous, but instead choosing the positive, which requires some effort. So this leads to the question, will valence bias become more positive after we train participants in cognitive reappraisal? So after we give them these skills to arrive at a positive interpretation, will they then do that during this valence bias task? So just to review, valence bias is an individual's tendency to interpret ambiguity as negative or positive. Negativity is the default, and we think that reappraisal is what promotes positivity. So in study 1, we trained participants in reappraisal to see if this would equip them with the necessary skills to arrive at a more positive interpretation of ambiguity. Specifically, we measured valence bias before and after training participants to use cognitive reappraisal. This was with 29 new participants. So during the emotion regulation task, participants were shown negative images and instructed to either maintain their initial emotional responses or to reappraise and transform them to bring about positive emotions. So step by step, they would see a long fixation to help clear their mind. Then they would see the instruction telling them whether the next block they should maintain their initial reactions or if they should reappraise. Then they saw clearly negative images, so like a snake, barking dog, you have a fight, a gun, and like roaches. And so they'd either have to like apply the maintain or reappraise strategy, and then lastly rate how negative they felt just overall at that time. Not how negative the images were, but just how they felt. So when we look at those negativity ratings, asking them how negative do you feel overall, we see that participants do feel less negative after reappraising than after maintaining. Just to orient you to these plots, the orange and green are what you would see if it were a traditional bar graph. And so the top represents the average. And then the points, the little dots, are individuals' averages. And the curving outline represents the density, so how many people are at that point. When we compare ratings of faces across session, we don't really expect the ratings of clearly valenced faces to change. So ratings of angry faces remained clearly negative. Ratings of happy faces remained clearly positive. However, ratings of surprise did become less negative following the reappraisal training. So this suggests that cognitive reappraisal does give participants the mental tools they need to arrive at more positive interpretations of ambiguity. So these findings led to the question of whether this manipulation would affect other types of stimuli. So in this case, scenes, not just faces. Because in everyday life, scenes would have a little more ecological validity. We don't just see hovering faces. I mean, at least I don't. But we do see like the whole scene in context. It may include a face, but it may not. And there are scenes and situations in life that can be ambiguous. So in a new sample of 31 participants, we use the same methods, except instead of faces, we use images from the International Affective Picture System, or IAPS. So for instance, this isn't one of the actual stimuli because I was afraid of copyright infringement. So this is just one that looks like one of the stimuli, where it's unclear whether this is a tearful goodbye or is it a tearful reunion. So initially you might see the negative side of it because there was a separation. But if you were to reappraise, maybe you'd see the good thing that like, at this point in time, that person is with their family. So looking at the how do you feel overall, just like with study 1, again, we see that participants report feeling less negative after reappraising negative images. And we also see that while clearly negative IAPS don't change, nor do clearly positive IAPS, the ambiguous IAPS do show a decrease across session. So both study 1 and study 2 support the hypothesis that positive interpretations of ambiguity rely on a reinterpretation or reappraisal of the ambiguous stimulus. However, we were concerned that these results could be influenced by demand characteristics. So we like to think our undergrad research pool is pretty smart. So if we're like, do this thing, how negative do you feel? Do this other thing, how negative do you feel? We might be eliciting some demand characteristics, like they might tune into the fact that we think they'll feel less negative after reappraising. So this is where psychophysiological measures really help out, because that's something that you can control or that you can't control. You have a lot less control over. And so that's what study 3 included, was the same exact tasks and stimuli, except we had participants rate blocks of faces and blocks of IAPS, and we also measured EMG and EDA during all the tasks. So now I will diverge a bit and talk more about exactly what these two measures buy us. So the EMG electrodes, these two here, this one's just put around, but the ones placed here measure the face's muscle activity at a specific location, in this case the corrugator. And we specifically measured this part, or this muscle, because it contracts in response to negative affect and relaxes in response to positive affect. So that way it gives us a nice objective measure of participants' valence. So they might say that they're feeling less negative. If they are feeling less negative, we'll see a corrugator decrease. And I'll talk more later on about the specific hypotheses that we had related to EMG, but for now I'll go into some details about the data collection and analysis process. So here is the raw data. Like, this is what you would see if you're in the lab having the electrodes on the brow, data's coming in, and you do see these big blips. That's the technical term of activity. What do you think those might represent?
Negative stimulus presentation?
Yeah, exactly. So this is going to be specifically when they are making that muscle movement. So this is a very exaggerated example. In real time, you probably wouldn't notice a perceptible change, but these electrodes are picking up on that increased muscle contraction, likely in response to negativity. What you also see are these like smaller, more consistent blips. Any idea what that might be? So these are eye blinks. It's since the senses are located right on the brow, which is right near the eye. And a lot of these pictures, you can see that when people are blinking, there's probably some activity like right above their eye at the brow. And so you do see that, and that is just good old-fashioned noise in the data. But with the acknowledged software, so the hardware is BioPack, that's what we use, and then the software is acknowledge. You can filter out the blinks with a high-pass filter. Then you rectify the signal, so make all negative voltages positive, so they don't average out to 0. And then you take the root mean square for further smoothing and noise reduction. And because it's kind of hard to see between the pink and the green lines, this whole segment is about 80 seconds. So I'll zoom in here right on 1 second of data. So this is just 1 second. You can see the blink. You can see how the high pass filter essentially takes out the blink. You rectify the signal and then you smooth it out. You can see there's a lot more jaggedy signal here with the pink, and then with the green, it's nice and smooth. You might notice that, yeah, the blink still comes through a little bit, but when you compare it to like this huge thing, that little blink is virtually non-significant difference. So this filtering does a nice job of picking that up. We also recorded Eda Electrodermal Activity, and so this essentially measures the amount of sweat that is on the surface of your skin. And we run a small current between these two electrodes, and the idea is that more sweat equals more salt and moisture, and you'll get a more conductive current between the two electrodes. What's unique about EDA is that it's solely under the control of the sympathetic nervous system, whereas changes in like heart rate, blood pressure, pupil diameter, those could all be attributable to either sympathetic or parasympathetic systems, but EDA is only sympathetic nervous system. Previous work has shown that EDA is greater for surprised faces, which makes sense in that ambiguity, there may be a greater need to activate fight or flight. That ambiguity might present more of a threat. However, with regard to EDA versus maintain versus reappraise, the findings in the literature are really mixed, but I'll get into that a bit later. A bit less processing we have to do with the data. but we do have a low pass filter that smooths it out, and because it's basically impossible to see the changes, I will again zoom in from this 80-second clip into a 1-second clip. And even now it's a bit hard to see, but the line down here is a lot smoother than the line up here. Because EDA is slow moving, you're not going to see any changes that are short and quick. You're just going to see these nice long graceful movements. So any variance that you see is noise, and that's why you're using the filter to get that out there. So zooming back out on the EDA waveform over 80 seconds, what you do want to see during data collection is this nice smooth wave line where over the course of maybe 10 seconds you see an increase and a decrease. Any sudden spike down to 0, so if it just like was going along nice and smooth and then dipped down and came back up, that would indicate poor electrode attachment. So sometimes the hands are so sweaty that the electrodes don't stick, the adhesive comes off. Sometimes there's not enough gel, so you don't actually have contact with the skin. And I guess one issue with EDA is like if you see that during a session and it doesn't correct by itself, it just keeps detaching. If you don't want to interrupt the behavioral data, there's really nothing that you can do in the moment. You just kind of have to wait, and then before the next block, like go in and fix it. There is something that you can do offline. So if you do see that and it's just like at one time point, you can connect the 2 points of the waveform, and Acknowledge will do that automatically for you. But if it's like jaggedy throughout the whole session, unfortunately that does happen, and you would just have to exclude that participant from the analyses. When looking at other people's EDA data, so has anyone here used the Empatica wristbands or heard of them? So they're these like, it's like a wristwatch, and it measures heart rate and also EDA and probably something else that I can't remember, and motion. But with that, it's really, really hard to get a good connection. And so I've had experience trying to look at data collected with these where close attention wasn't paid during data collection, and the signal's just all over the place. And you just can't use that data because you feel like those weren't attached, essentially. So it's not difficult, but you just really have to know what to look out for when you use these. So looking at the levels, you see a lot of, well not here, but across participants, you see a lot of variation in the ranges of EDA. So like some people just tend to be more physiologically aroused at rest than others. But some people are just low responders. Like you'll never see their EDA go above 2 microsiemens, even under extreme arousal. And so it's like, if you looked at their hand, they would just have like a dry hand. So that could be like due to some dermatological property, or some like psychophysiological property, but you just have to exclude them as well. A normal range is like between about 7 and 20, so this is right where we want it to be pretty much. I haven't actually seen it, but theoretically, if somebody was just like consistently at like 20 microsiemens, could never physiologically calm down, we'd have to exclude them as well, but that hasn't ever happened in my experience. Because again, it's not really something that you can control, unless you did something very dramatic, like start breathing heavily. And so like during a session, if somebody sneezes, we have to take a note of like when that happens. If somebody like shifts around in their chair a lot, you'll see an EDA spike, and it's not related to the task, so you just have to take note of that, and like later on. It's a lot more sensitive than, they're both very sensitive measures, but participants aren't aware, I guess, of all the things that can affect EDA, and we don't necessarily want them there. All right, so going back to the study and how we use these to look at valence bias and the demand characteristics during the reappraisal task. So this is the behavioral data from study 1, the ratings of how negative do you feel, just for comparison. So if our participants do actually feel less negative when they're reappraising, and they're not just telling us what they think we want to hear, we would see decreased EMG during reappraisal, because the decreased EMG, the muscle relaxation, is associated with positivity. Similarly, we would expect to see increased EMG during the maintained blocks, because from baseline, they would be experiencing negativity and would show that muscle contraction of the cord here. Looking at the EDA predictions, like I said, it's unclear whether we would see increased or decreased EDA in response to reappraisal versus maintain. So we didn't have very specific predictions, that's why predictions is in quotes. But we do have some ideas. So differences between maintain and reappraise in EDA could be due to how attentionally demanding the task is. So reappraisal requires more attention, thus the stimuli become more significant, require greater focus, more amping up. So you might see increased EDA during reappraise compared to maintain. Alternatively, while changing the valence of the stimuli, maybe participants are also trying to make it less arousing. So they say, okay, maybe in that horrible negative scene, things aren't that bad. So they're not that bad. That kind of changes both the valence and arousal. So if they're changing their arousal properties of the stimuli, they might be changing their physiological arousal and decreasing it. So, because also our friend EDA takes a few seconds to show a response, in that other graph, over a 10-second period is when you see the rise and fall. We extended the fixation period so that we can see the full response to each individual stimulus. I will say that this, some participants did seem to get annoyed by this. So because it's just imagine just sitting in silence for 7 to 11 seconds and not knowing when the next thing is going to come. So I don't think that affected our results, but it is something to consider if you're going to make these relatively short tasks much longer by trying to accurately measure EDA. And we also added a red cross so that participants would be sure to attend to the next stimulus. So when we consider baseline, we look at the baseline before the red cross. And so the design was the exact same with the Valence Bias task, except that we added EMG and EDA, and the emotion regulation task was the same, where they saw the fixation, instruction, then they used the instruction, and then they rated how negative they felt. Looking at those negativity ratings, we see that, again, participants said they felt less negative after the reappraisal blocks and after the maintain blocks. And again, with the behavioral ratings of the stimuli, we see that negative stimuli didn't change across session, but the ambiguous stimuli did, while the positive stimuli also remain the same across session. So again, replicating the results from study 1 and study 2 here in study 3. These are the EMG averages, or actually Z-scores. So this is exactly the same as it would be with a bar graph, but it's just zoomed out so much because these plots are capturing every single individual average. So here it is 0. And with EMG, we saw reduced activation during reappraised blocks. So this is consistent with having lower negative ratings and actually feeling less negative when reappraising versus maintaining. So with regard to our concerns of demand characteristics, this showed that participants were likely actually feeling less negative. They weren't just reporting what they thought we wanted to hear. With EMG during the valence bias task, we only saw main effective valence, so not an order by valence effect like with the ratings. But each valence was significantly different from each other and in the directions that we would expect. So this is kind of a nice manipulation check we saw that EMG increased for negative stimuli, decreased for positive stimuli, and it's kind of at 0 for ambiguous, but that we saw that people both increased and decreased for ambiguous stimuli. However, if we do take a look at those null effects of order and valence, you still see a lot of variability among the ambiguous stimuli, granted also with the clearly valent stimuli, but you only see that individual variability in the behavioral ratings with ambiguous stimuli. So like the clearly negative, clearly positive are pretty much clustered together, but we see a lot of variability here. So what we wanted to examine was, are the people who are decreasing the most in their ratings are becoming the most positive in their ratings? Are they also becoming more positive in their EMG? Are they showing less EMG towards ambiguity? And so we looked at the correlation between changes in ratings of ambiguous stimuli across session. So here, higher scores meant that they became more negative. Negative scores meant they became more positive, as well as changes in corrugator across session. So the higher scores reflect more muscle contraction, more browning. In the lower scores, the negative scores represent muscle relaxation associated with positivity. And we see that those who became more negative in session 2 also showed increased corrugator. So presumably the reappraisal training did not affect them. But those who became more positive, who had a decrease in their ratings of ambiguous stimuli, also showed decreased corrugator, which suggests that they did, in fact, arrive at a positive interpretation of ambiguity following the reappraisal training. With EDA, we didn't see any difference between maintain and reappraise. Yep, nothing there. And we did see an order by valence effect with the EDA during the face rating, or sorry, not face rating, but the faces and IAPS rating task. But it's mostly driven by this very odd effect of EDA being decreased for negative stimuli in session 1, which is just really bizarre and possibly something that's happened more by chance. This EDA becoming or decreasing across session for the ambiguous stimuli is at trend. So I don't want to read too much into that, but it would be in a direction suggesting that maybe you are changing the arousal properties of the stimulus when you're changing the valence. That's kind of a big leap, but just one thing that we could consider. So to summarize, study 1 and 2 provide evidence that those who are able to interpret ambiguity as positive are thinking about the image differently. They're reappraising that which is typically negative by default. And our emotion regulation task, the maintain versus reappraise, perhaps is teaching them this skill, and then that skill is transferring over to the session 2 ratings of ambiguity. And then study 3 suggests that this reappraisal actually reduces the implicit negativity that participants are experiencing towards the clearly negative images, and maybe is leading to the actual decreased negativity in feelings, not just reporting in session 2. Lastly, I would like to thank my mentor and advisor, Maytal Mehta, the lab members who helped me run this study, especially Claudia and Bethany, our fantastic undergrad RAs. And we have our website here if you want to find out more about the work that we do. And lastly, thank you to you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
So I'm really curious about the reappraisal task. So do you find any individual differences on the effect of the task? Like, is everybody reacting similarly to the task, or somebody might change more, someone might not change that much after the task, after the training?
Yeah, definitely. Good question. So with the individual data points for, I guess it would be nice to look at a change score and see the individual points for a change score. And unfortunately, I don't have that in a visual. But you can see for some people during the maintain task, they still didn't feel that negative. And some people during the reappraise task, they still felt like 4 out of 5, 80% negative. So definitely individual differences in how how negatively they felt during this. And I would imagine also individual differences in how much they changed.
So I guess kind of to follow up on that question, I'm thinking about the people in the difference plot that you showed that were not like affected by the training.
Let me pull that up.
I guess the question that I have there is like, what do you think are like features of those people, or like what is making them less receptive?
Yeah, I think that there may just be some traits that make this easier for some people. When we look at the DERS, the difficulties in emotion regulation, we see that people who have lower DERS, so fewer difficulties in emotion regulation, just in daily life, not even with this task, they tend to have the greatest decreases in maintain versus reappraise and in the negativity ratings across session. So perhaps it might have to do with people just naturally being better in general at reappraisal and emotion regulation. Another thought is that there could be cumulative effects over the lifetime. So one of the reasons why I'm interested in stress and stress reactivity is that that's another individual difference variable. And so I'm curious as to whether, like, if you are stress reactive over the course of your lifetime, if that just tends to lead you to be more negative overall. And so even in this task, when we're teaching you reappraisal, it just doesn't have that effect because it's so strongly ingrained.
So I had a question about reappraisal and how you, in your reappraisal task, basically it was all negative images and they had to reappraise it, think of it maybe in a positive light, right? But can reappraisal work in the opposite direction too, with positive images being reappraised to be negative?
Positive images. Are you asking if that happened in this task?
I'm asking because in your reappraisal phase of learning, it was all negative images, but it could have been like, let's say, half negative, half positive, and no matter what it is, you have to reappraise it in the opposite direction to what the first instinct is, maybe. Like, do you think that the reappraisal process is only going from negative to positive, or can it also go positive to negative?
In this task, we definitely were very clear that the images that they saw would be negative and that we were trying to get them to make them less negative and or more positive. So in this task, it was very clear that, and the images themselves are pretty extreme, very negative, sometimes like horrifying. So there really isn't much positivity that you can see during the reappraisal task. But during the ratings task, I think there could be some positivity that you might pick up on, but because the whole reappraisal training was about becoming more positive, if during the rating task you saw some ambiguous image that did have positivity, you would probably pick up on that positivity and try to enhance it. Does that answer your question or not?
It answers it partially, but I guess the one thing I'm thinking about is you were able to address the demand characteristics by using these physiological measures, which is great, but you could have also done just, reappraisal across both directions, in which case there wouldn't be a demand in only one direction, negative to positive. And also, I feel like, I don't know, there could be a difference between having people learn how to treat negative images more positively versus have people learn to interpret the interpretation of photos in a more complex way. Do you like that could be a different thing? The latter being just a deeper interpretation, the first being try to think of things positively, and that could be a priming thing where that later induces physiological effects.
Right. That's a really good point. So, and I think especially the idea that the images are complex, that there's like so many factors that you could take in viewing this one little scene on the screen. We did take this task from other literature, and in emotion regulation, this seems to be standard from my understanding, that you are trying to use this simplistic, like just make it more positive using the strategy of reappraisal, reinterpretation, so thinking about the scene differently. And the EMG especially addresses the demand characteristics, but there still could be some effects with priming, like it still could be more temporary. And so one thing that we do want to do is have this study and where we maybe bring people back in a week and then 2 weeks, and not have them do the reappraisal task at those follow-up time points, but just have them do the rating task. So like there wouldn't be as much of a priming like a week later, but see, like, is the skill really, like having learned this reappraisal skill, going to carry over?
Just a really quick clarification. I think I might have missed it, but when they're completing the rating task after the reappraisal training, are they explicitly asked to reappraise in that task?
Nope. We have them finish the reappraisal training task, and then we say, okay, now we're just going to do the session that we did last week where you rate the images as positive or negative, go as quickly as you can. So we just kind of transition into it quickly without drawing attention to the connection.
That's really interesting. I feel like that's, yeah, I feel like that makes me think that this is pretty powerful then.
Mm-hmm. And afterward, when, debriefing with people, we didn't explicitly ask, like, did you try to reappraise during the rating task? I kind of wish we had. Going forward, we probably will. But talking to some people, it was clear that they were like, yeah, I thought that like I was seeing, especially with the IAPs, I was seeing the scenes more positively. And so I think some people like caught on, but maybe it was just like a hunch. And we definitely tried not to make it seem so obvious.
How are you thinking about what these results might mean in terms of like applied practices like therapy or more realistic situations?
Yeah, I honestly don't have much applied practice or clinical training or anything, but I think this is really bolstering the evidence that initial negativity that initial interpretations of ambiguity are negative, that people aren't just interpreting or seeing the good stuff just randomly, that there is room for interventions and manipulations to help people become more positive, that you're not kind of stuck with what you have, you're not stuck with the bias that you have. You can change it. And you can change it to be more negative. So if you stress people out, you would see greater negativity. So maybe on the one hand, you look at ways to decrease negativity in daily life, and on the other hand, training people to be more positive, that there is room for that. And along those lines, Heather Uri, who I cited in regards to the EDA, she was actually clinically trained, and I just had a conversation with her during Society of Affective Science, but she was trained in clinical psychology, but now does emotion regulation. And so I think it's really neat that there can definitely be a huge marriage between like the applied practice and this research just on healthy populations.
So I'm just kind of thinking about this in that, I don't know, sometimes it can be great and perhaps less stressful to think positively about things that you experience that are negative or maybe ambiguous. But other times it probably is quite adaptive to just kind of keep that negative thought there so that you can avoid situations in the future, or so that you can alert and prepare yourself both cognitively and physiologically for some type of reaction to that stimulus. So I guess what you're kind of just talking about seems to suggest that we want to be shifting people in the positive direction, but do you think that there's conditions or limits to that, or yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think in situations where it is ambiguous, so in daily life, if something's ambiguous and it could be positive or it could be negative, then it'd be beneficial to see the positive, right? But in daily life, like few things are so ambiguous. If something is, like we don't just see the hovering surprise face, you'll see somebody like that, and then you'll hear the car screech, and like hear the crash and something. And so in that case, many more contextual clues come into play. And in that case, if your body and your brain would respond in such a way as to like protect you and like identify the threat and get prepared to combat it. But maybe you are just looking at like a photo and it's not something that's directly affecting you. If you choose to see the positive in that, even if it is a negative scene, there isn't anything inherently dangerous to you about that. And even in your own experience, like if you say like get rejected from like a training program or something, there is negative in that, but it's not dangerous to look at the positive side of it. So like if you don't get into some sort of program, you can say, oh, well, I have time for other things. That's not a danger to you. So in real world context, yes, it's a very appropriate to be see a negative thing when it can harm you. But in so many contexts, it's very beneficial to try to reappraise and interpret.
I'm wondering, maybe you could just speak a little bit about what you think are the neurophysiological mechanisms that are afoot in this reappraisal task.
Yes. Let me get to the slide with the article. Right, so I think the two key players are going to be prefrontal cortex and amygdala. So people who can reappraise are better able to recruit their prefrontal cortex and have a stronger inverse relationship so that their amygdala activity will deep. This recent paper by a postdoc, former lab managers, and Tall, shows that those with a negative bias show brain activity similar, if they have a negative bias with regards to their rating, they show brain activity that's similar to maintaining negativity during the maintain versus reappraise task. And those with a positive bias show activity similar to reappraisal when viewing surprise faces. So there's definitely even earlier evidence that there's a strong inverse relationship between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala in that you would see changes in those two. So in my dissertation, what I'm hoping to look at is even like resting state data with those who have a stronger predisposition, genetic predisposition to stress reactivity, thinking that they will have a more negative valence bias, and if they do, just during rest, will they tend to have like a more hyperactive amygdala? And will they have more or less amygdala prefrontal connectivity? Presumably less, presumably that their like threat detection system, because they're so threat reactive throughout life, would lead to that kind of resting state individual difference.
So kind of a low-level question related to EDA and EMG. So I will preface this by saying I know very little about these techniques, but at first pass, they sound similar in a lot of ways to how we model and understand fMRI data. But obviously, for someone who's starting up and maybe wanting to learn a new technique, as an experimenter, what do you, do you feel like, I mean, you mentioned some of the hassles with collecting the data, the things that are not related to it can affect it, but what are the kind of the major pros and cons in your mind of collecting this type of data? And obviously you've used it in an interesting way here to address the demand characteristics, but just in general, if you're thinking about starting up a study, would you recommend using these techniques?
Yeah, so it actually, and especially BioPack, the hardware company, makes it very easy. We have a ton of YouTube tutorials, and it's much more simpler than MRI analysis, because like obviously you're dealing with even just fewer dimensions. You're not dealing with like space and like a 3D brain. So like these few steps can even be automated with scripts, which makes it super easy. And so there is like movement to consider, especially with EDA, but it's not like in MRI where like 2 millimeters is going to destroy the world. It's more just like if you see like major shifts, that's something to be aware of. And like I said, I wasn't meaning to like bash the Empatica wristbands. I think that's awesome that you can have this like one little device that gets this measure instead of having to buy like the whole setup. But I think just with like a few considerations and just like BioPack even has these like video conference trainings and Q&As that they record that it's super easy to pick up on. A great textbook is, oh, why am I blanking? But it's a giant yellow textbook about psychophysiology and just physiological measures, and Cassioppo is one of the authors. And that's just great like considerations about methodology, and even integrating several of these methods together. Also, you can use these in the scanner, so there is the noise factor, but so many people have done it now that it's possible to get like the exact specifications to make it work. Even like EMG on the face is able to work, which is crazy considering that like it's like your brain's here and your face is here, that you can still get the EMG signal from that. Yeah. And also, so with EDA, even like if you're worried about maybe the MRI environment being super stressful, you could gather EDA during the MRI session. And like say somebody is, like they just never, ever, ever show a decrease in EDA, you might say, okay, this was consistently stressful for them. But if you do see like the consistent decline over time, you would conclude, okay, like maybe they did acclimate to this environment. Like we even have some people fall asleep in the scanner, so obviously it's not universally stressful or physiologically arousing, but that's one way that you can actually measure that, even easier than cortisol samples.
I think that's really interesting, yeah, and just improve your data quality that way. If your task is related to.
And like theoretically, you know, you could have someone in like a scanner with an EEG cap measuring EMG and EDA. Like you could, you could have hooked up to everything, get like temporal, spatial, arousal, valence, all kind of stuff at once.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. Does anyone here use either EMG or EDA? Well, if you are interested, I would be more than happy to help with anything regarding setup and stuff. It's a little bit of a learning curve, but very easy to include. It's something that even if you're not, even if like career trajectory wise, you don't end up somewhere with scanning facilities, you could still have like this component in your lab where you're getting measures related to the brain, because the brain is what controls the body and these systems that are at play. And so at my undergrad, like this was what really got me to like fall in love with psychology and like the ways that we can read what's going on inside the brain through like what the body's doing. And even though like I didn't have any scanning experience in undergrad, I did have this experience. And it's really something that's really cool. So yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, but do you have to then control for like making sure that the temperature of the room is always constant, and other extraneous factors that might induce sweating?
Yes, we do try to keep it constant. During the summer, even though it says it's the same temperature, it doesn't feel the same temperature. So like I've been known to bring like a fan into the room and try to like keep things level. I will lose my mind if there's like loud talkers outside of the room, because that could affect EDA because you're like attending to that. People's phones, I'm sort of militant about like, all right, please put your phone away. Like, you can put it in your backpack. We'll put your backpack over here. Like, get off your phone because like it's going to change all the results. So you do have to take into like a lot more about the physical environment. We also have participants sit in a chair that doesn't have wheels, so they can't be, because like if you're in a chair with wheels, you just kind of like shift around. I'm not right now, but like that way they stay stable. But definitely a few more factors to consider.
Are you also able to do like heart rate? Would that correlate with the EDA?
Yeah, I am actually not that familiar with heart rate, but that is something that many people do collect along with it. So theoretically, you could get heart rate and EDA and somehow subtract what you get from the EDA signal. And so then like the residual of what differences the heart rate is showing might clue you into like parasympathetic activity not related to sympathetic activity, if that makes sense. If EDA is so exclusive to the sympathetic nervous system.
Cool.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have to chat today. And just to be respectful of everyone's time, I just want to thank Catie for this insightful talk.
Thank you very much for listening in. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, if you have additional questions, and if you have time, Catie, I'm sure, I don't know if that's possible, I'm sure we'd be happy to ask a few additional things, but I would just
definitely.
pause and let people do their thing. Thanks.